Hello, everyone, and welcome to Altitude. I am, of course, your host, Woody Woodworth. I have a really cool special guest today, someone who I have been dying to get on the show for months now and has been very generous with his time and energy to come join us. I have Brad Casemore. Brad is really cool. He's an industry giant. He has been one of the lead marketing analysts for networking and connectivity at IDC for at least 10 years and has over 30 years of experience in the industry with all kinds of roles and leadership positions. So, Brad, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much, Woody. I left, you suppose I left IDC relatively recently, just last summer. It's strange. I say I'm retired, but I don't think it's retirement in the sense most people conceive of it as kind of, sitting out in the sun and under a parasol and that sort of thing. I'm still engaged, which I think most people who retire remain engaged with life, with everything that's going on around them. But I'm certainly, I'm not dead yet. I'll put it that way. So
Oh, great. Obviously, you're here on the show alive and kicking. So that's fantastic. So today we are going to talk about a really unique, important topic, and that is the rise of networking in the consciousness of the executive, or maybe in the mind of business. And I think this is a very timely point to have this discussion because I have noticed over the last 2 years that networking has become just supremely important in all of the business conversations that I'm having, that our customers are having, that the industry pundits and professionals are having. And so I'm here to get your opinion based on all your wisdom and experience, on why that is. What are the catalysts and outcomes and challenges that come along with networking suddenly coming into focus? So I'll coach our listeners with an analogy on my line of thinking, and then I'll let you jump right in. So, of course, some of our listeners are networking propeller heads like yours truly here. Some of them, I'm sure, aspire to be a networking propeller head, which is wonderful. We need you in the industry. And some come from different walks of life, developers or business executives, et cetera. So to kind of lay the foundation, I have always compared networking, or at least traditionally, when I'm just explaining it to, say, like my mom or my friend who is in the military and, has no computer experience, or at least not in the venue I'm in, as basically the plumbing system of a data center, right? It's critical. It moves a lot of important stuff around. It's a source of life, a wellspring, but it's hidden and you really don't care about it or know about it until it breaks. And then
right.
all of a sudden it's a big, big deal because, hey, you can't take a shower, you can't wash your dishes, you can't even get a glass of water. Well, I think networking recently has moved from the status of being the plumbing to being like the electrical system of your home, insofar as, like plumbing, it's everywhere, but it's much more present in your daily life. You see it and feel it everywhere. All of your critical devices and important things that you're doing in your house, be it, cooking or cleaning or entertainment, all need electricity. And you get a monthly bill for it, kind of unlike plumbing, which is just built in, but electricity, you're now on the meter. And thus, when something goes wrong or isn't right with your electrical system, you know about it. If your monthly bill is too high, you know about it. If you can't cook on your stove or you can't turn on a light switch, you know about it. And to get that fixed becomes critical. So there's my analogy. What do you think of that? And second, what do you think are some of the factors behind this?
Yeah, no, I think the analogy is apt, and we can expand upon it a little. I do think plumbing versus utility versus electricity is appropriate because it is true that I think for most organizations, the network, of course, has always been there and it's always been important, but the criticality has gone up in recent years. And if you think about it, let's go back to that plumbing era, which was right up until, I guess, into this century and right up until the aughts. You had a network and it was supporting your IT functions, but your IT functions weren't necessarily your business. And if we look at what's happened, it was a support. It was very important support. But if something went wrong with the network, it'd be down for a while. People would be inconvenienced. There would be a certain business cost, but it would be a modest one. And you could get it fixed, you get back up, and it's no big deal. But as IT became the business, as we went through big digital transformation in the last decade or so, going back more than a decade, what we noticed was that all of a sudden it became critically important to have that network up at all times, right? I mean, if you had an outage, you wanted it to be minimal, right? You wanted it to be as minor a disruption as possible, and you wanted to mitigate any sort of possibility of disruptions because everything that coursed through that network was now business critical, right? And the network went everywhere. The network was the way you connected. Connectivity was more important because all of a sudden, whether we talk about organizations and their employees, whether we talk about their partners, whether we talk about their customers, that we're all connected to your business. That was a huge shift, right? When you think about when I got into this industry and for a good time afterward, you start off with local area networks. You start off with maybe a few servers in a room. If something went out, it usually just affected the people on premises. Today, it affects everything you do. And it's so critical. And I think the cloud also was a further accelerant to that because all of a sudden your endpoint, if you look at whether you're talking again about your employees, your partners, your customers, consumers, they're all connected in some way to you now. And your applications increasingly have migrated to the cloud. They're no longer in just an on-premises data center. They're in one cloud, maybe they're in two clouds, maybe they're in three clouds. Maybe you also have co-location facilities. And the network is the one commonality that goes everywhere. So without the network, you have a failure, right? You really is only good as your network. And I suppose your network, it's a bit of a pun, but it becomes your weakest link if it's not optimally operational. So it's more critical than ever. But here's a little paradox I'll put to you. It is more critical than ever. It is like utility, but you don't necessarily want to have to tend to it. You do want it to be invisible, but it's critical. So you begin to use things like, this is why we've seen a concomitant or accompanying use of things like automation, but not just automation in the terms of basic scripting that has to be done really repeatedly over time as changes are made, but you want intelligent automation that understands that you're trying to connect to one cloud or two clouds or three clouds. And you want to make that as simple as possible and as repeatable as possible, right? So that it will scale, so that it will be non-disruptive, so that it will be secure, so that it will be visible and able to be observed, because it's all critical to your, at the end of the day, the availability, responsiveness, and optimization of the network as really the digital nervous system for your organization.
That's a great way of framing it. I want to come back to that paradox a little later, because I think that's really an important point of our conversation, which is you want to get your arms around the network and have control of it all the time, and some sense of assurance and visibility, of course, with it. But at the same time, you don't want it to be up in your grill. You don't want to be thinking about the network day in, day out. It's something that should just kind of perpetually work. And I think that paradox creates a lot of tension and frustration with businesses who can't quite get that recipe right, or just struggle in the evolving relationship of trying to get that recipe right. So there's a lot to talk about there. I'm going to park that for a second. I'm a fan of history. For better or worse, I got a 4-year degree in history when I was an undergrad. So it influences all of my thinking. I can't help but think that the rise of the network also, of course, has to do with not only cloud, but other things that became associated with cloud, or that cloud was really good at. So, right, modern application delivery, which means the rise of mobility, the rise of mobile devices and apps that are always on, always connected, using the internet. But then, of course, private networks are there on the back end to make these systems function. And that in order to really beat or surpass your competition, you had to have flawless delivery capabilities with your network. It had to be able to scale. It had to be robust. It had to be able to deliver your content and your persona, your business persona, as fast as possible. And there are areas where you would lose out to your competition if, say, your shopping cart was 10% slower than your competitor's shopping cart. So it's kind of like this organic growth curve where people were all originally using the internet not for commerce, but for exploration. As the internet grows, the go-to-market capability for businesses to use it grow, and then mobility with Steve Jobs, the iPhone changes that forever, and thus the network becomes critically important. And then the rise of cloud makes a big splash, and whether or not the rise of cloud enabled modern app delivery more effectively or not is an interesting conversation we could have. I think it did. So I think it was a confluence. But then we have COVID, and then we have this idea of work from home, and this idea of decentralization, and everyone being out of the office, but at the same time having to be productive. And that I think is the final, I don't want to say nail in the coffin, that's not the right analogy, but the final piece of the puzzle that made networking so indispensable. Because now not only can you, if the network fails, you're not delivering content to your consumers, you can't even have a functioning business anymore. Or at
Yeah.
least your business has been severely degraded because your employees can't be productive. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's great. And I would say you're absolutely right there. I always think, as somebody who covered data center networking before I covered data center and cloud, I always thought about the network well, there are three pieces to it, but let's talk about two basic ones. There's where the applications reside in the data center, of course, and of course the cloud over time. You need a network for that, and it needs to be extremely responsive, highly available. It needs to be increasingly automated. It needs to have agility, flexibility, elastic scale, all of those things. And then you've got the endpoints, as you said, right? You're right, absolutely right. As we had the growth of mobility and mobile devices, everybody has a mobile device. I've got one that's turned off so it doesn't interrupt our call, but we got several of them. We've got computers, we've got phones, and that includes every customer of your organization or your company. That includes all your employees. So the endpoints have multiplied over time. Like you say, they're always on. Applications are more important than ever. Applications are really the heart of the business. You need the digital service, basically the digital nervous system where the heart is. You need the digital nervous system out at the edge, which is really where the extremities are, where all the people are with their devices. And the network is critical across that entire landscape, whether it's where the applications reside inside a data center or whether it's where they're consumed, which is where the users are. So I think your point is well taken. Now, as for cloud, I would agree with you. I think if you look at the way the cloud operators did things, and this is still something where enterprises are trying to catch up as they become more digital, the cloud operators understood that you had to have cloud native applications, right? And that's where the term comes from, the cloud and cloud native. That meant not just virtualized, because you could virtualize a monolithic application, but you had to break it down into microservices. And the cloud did that better than anybody. And now everybody's been playing catch up since then. And now, of course, we're moving into the AI era. We could talk about that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I think why the cloud operators did is pretty obvious. That was their business. They had to learn how to get every bit of juice out of their infrastructure in their data centers. And they had to run it at optimal efficiency. They had to automate it to the hilt. And everybody saw that. And they said, wow, those guys really know how to do this. Right? This is their business. And we've all been learning from what they've been doing. So I would totally agree with you in terms of they took that cloud stack and cloud applications and they popularized it. And now everybody uses it, right? Even telcos who I used to think, telcos are never going to get this stuff. They've gradually got there. They moved from virtual network functions now to containerized network functions. So even they have made that shift, but it happened first in the cloud. So I would totally agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Great topic. Let's address that paradox now, and then weave that into a discussion on how businesses are or should be responding to that paradox or trying to unravel it or solve it. And again, that paradox is the network shouldn't be something that bothers you, and it should be functioning at all times. And you really should be focusing your business energies on serving your customers and building the platforms that enable this. But at the same time, you can't lose control or you can't lose visibility and insight into the network. So you have to have some way of constantly knowing its state and status. So you both want to know about it and you don't, right? So how do you think businesses are grappling with this, especially with this big rise of networking we've just discussed over the last 2 or 3 years? Are they changing their patterns and practices? Are they changing the way they hire and skill? Are they changing the ways they invest?
Yeah.
Let's get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I do think there is a gradual change taking place. Now, of course, when we talk about organizations, when we talk about enterprises, there's always a spectrum, right? There are, for instance, some of the more savvy financial services companies who are right at the bleeding edge of modifying their architecture, their operations, their day-to-day management of their infrastructure. And they've moved, further away, or let's say farther ahead than some of the others. So they're, and then you've got others who are, that's why we talk about laggards and leaders, right? Some are laggards. It takes them longer to get there. I guess the first thing I will say is kind of caveat that there is a spectrum, but the ones who are doing it well, I would say have made changes already. They no longer have all these silos, operational silos, the network, compute, storage, et cetera. They've
Mm,
moved to more of a DevOps premised way of running IT. So you've got a platform team now under the auspices of a digital or cloud architect. And they're thinking from the outset about not only what they need to support the applications and data that are so critical to the company's success, but what sort of teams they need, how they need to structure those teams, what the operational model looks like. The operational model must be agile, it must be software driven. So you begin to think about that. Now, that doesn't mean that your layer 2 and 3 people go away. It
mm,
just means that they become part of the team. They become part of that team that is application driven and application led. And they're
right.
not siloed because you don't want them disconnected from the process. You want them to understand that the job of the network, the purpose of the network is to be an absolutely essential to support to the application driven business. Right. And I think these are the leading organizations. Now, of course, that also pulls in security. It pulls in, how you look at the entire network stack. One of the things we've seen as a result of cloud is we no longer think of the network as this kind of bifurcated, very fractured entity where you look at layer 2, 3, and maybe some of 4, and you say, okay, I'm going to have these are the old, we'll call them hardware driven, hardware defined networkers who, are only looking at what the box does. Now we also know it's very important what happens up at the app layer too, right? You have to
Yeah.
have, this is where we've seen kind of the application performance monitoring and MPM kind of come together over time. Because it's very important that we understand that full stack and we understand the entire landscape on which those applications reside across clouds, how they're delivered to users, the round trip, right, from the user back to the data center where the app resides, so that you can continually tune your infrastructure on a continuous basis. And that's why, as you said, visibility and observability are so important across this landscape. It becomes absolutely critical. Security, too, of course.
Great comments. I couldn't agree more. However, to keep things lively, I always aim to misbehave a little bit. Like
That's all
one of
right.
the characters from my favorite show says, I'll see if any of sci-fi nerds caught that. So to throw a wrench in this a little bit, it's clear that the ideal state is kind of a kumbaya where we have layer 2, layer 3 people not siloed anymore, working hand in hand with DevOps and application people so they can support this application lifecycle in an agile way, an automated way, and be there to understand the importance of the network to the application and vice versa.
Yep.
However, I think that's one thing in theory. I think in practice, we're going to see varying degrees of success here due to a couple of factors, right? The maturity of an organization, the company culture, but also hybrid is real and hybrid will be real forever.
Yep.
In my opinion, it's at least forever as long as I'm around, which is forever for me. So, so these layer 2, layer 3 people still have this whole data center world to tend to
Yep.
that's running Cisco and Juniper and Palo and F5 and these things, Metal,
Yep.
or at least a private cloud, which is different than public cloud operationally in some ways. And so they're not going to be able to just let go of this world and kind of join this kumbaya 100%, right? So they're, I don't want to say trapped, but man, I mean, they've got to learn to be agile and they've got to learn to work with DevOps people, but they can't cut bait on the data center. So what is that doing to our industry?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And in the organizations that I saw where, this is just a few years ago, we used to talk to a lot of C-level executives in organizations and they said, I really have to run more mobile apps. I have to run more more data-based apps, data analytics. But my traditional IT team just can't move with the agility I need. And they said, so this is why we're kind of obviating them or circumventing them and going to the cloud, right? This is why we saw a lot of modern apps, to your
Mm,
point, go to the cloud. It wasn't just that, the cloud was purpose built to run those apps. It was that, to your point, the traditional data center wasn't built to do it. And the teams weren't necessarily conversant with the technologies that they would have to implement to make it happen effectively. I think what you see, to your point, it is a hybrid world, and I don't want to be too stark in the way I'm describing this, but I would say what you generally saw is that a lot of the traditional apps were stay behind apps, right? They would be in the data center. They run there for, as you said, time immemorial, right? I still see to this day in the insurance industry, apps that run on mini computers, the AS400. So
Mm,
it just shows how long these things live, right? They go on living and living and living for years and
yeah.
years and years. Occasionally you get a hardware refresh every 10 years or whatever. But what you saw was the modern apps move to the cloud. So there's been a
Mhm.
bit of a dichotomy, right? Where you might say, okay, we're going to run things traditionally because how much does that traditional environment really change? It doesn't change as fast as a cloud native environment or a cloud environment where you're always tuning the apps, you're always bringing in new apps, you're bringing in new services. That's where you're doing your blue green stuff, right? Your canary
Mhm.
stuff. It's all occurring in the cloud. But over time, more and more of that is going to occur according to that ethos, right? With kind of platform teams and so forth. But you're right, you may have those old apps and those more traditional ways of doing things for a long time. And organizations will have to learn how to make that pivot over time. And, it might be in some organizations 60-40 today, and it could move to 80-20 over the next 10 years, maybe 10, 20 years after that, when like you said, you and I are long out of the industry, but it's something organizations, I think, consider all the time. And I've seen some who've gotten out of the data center business entirely. And I say it from an enterprise perspective. They said, no, we're going to run everything in the cloud. But you really have to know what you're doing to refactor a lot of those traditional apps. Even with a thing like you mentioned F5, right? I saw organizations, they said the thing that's really been the challenge for us has been the load balancer because, we wrote those policies in Tickle 20 years ago, right? And nobody knows what they do, right? No, nobody.
Right.
So it's almost like you have to be Inspector Clouseau to figure out exactly how you're going to rebuild that stuff in the cloud, right? So
Oh,
it's
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, Tickle. So, folks that are listening that might not be F5 heads, I worked at F5 for 8 years. So, some of those Tickle scripts, which F5 brands as iRules, I have written. And at the time I was writing it, I wasn't really sure what it was going to do. And I sure as hell don't know what it's going to do now. So, there's a lot of that. I guess we'd call it tech debt. Load balancers are tricky business, man.
Yeah.
That is, you have these intelligent proxies that are so intertwined with the way the application works because they see all 7 layers of the network if we're still doing the OSI model. And they are tricky to move to the cloud. You can't really just lift and shift them because it's very expensive. It's very cumbersome. And the way that cloud handles virtual machine availability means even
Yeah.
if you have a virtual load balancer doing your availability, how the hell do you handle load balancer availability? Right? Meaning I need more than one F5 or Citrix or whatever. If this goes down, I need to fail over. That linchpin is, from my experience as an architect, what you do is you just kick the can.
Yeah.
So you solve availability for your application, but now you create an availability problem in a more critical tier, which is your proxy load balancer tier, because they are traditionally looking for layer 2 instructions on how the network operates.
Yeah,
Right?
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is one very complicated ball of wax, and organizations struggle with that. That's one of the reasons they keep some apps behind. They say, I
Yeah.
don't know how I'm going to recreate this environment, and I don't know if I'm going to break the whole thing, right? When I actually make the move. Yeah.
Well, all right. Here's an interesting thought while we switch gears, move on to another tangent. You talked a lot about the need for infrastructure and networking, and of course, security wishes its fine bedfellow to be automated. And this is really the way that one of the ways kind of out of that paradox we discussed, because if you're automating, you have the ability to be agile and the ability to repave quickly. And you have good insight into your best practices and templates and your foundational things. And if you're automating correctly, you get the hard work done and kind of out of the way. And thus the network shouldn't be up in your grill every day. And if there needs to be a change, you use automation to do that, which again helps this idea of fast recovery and fast growth, fast scale. However, I'm not sure as an industry, we've really been successful as a whole in automating the network. And so what are some of the thoughts around that? First, do you agree that the network, while it's starving for automation, really hasn't made it there yet? And two, if you agree, what factors do you think are stopping it from being automated fully?
Yeah, it's again, there is a spectrum, right? Of if you look at organizations, but I would say you're right. Most enterprises are certainly not entirely automated, and I think one of the reasons is that, again, to your point, I think they've thought about it more of a piecemeal fashion. So unlike the cloud giants, and I've sat through many keynotes from the folks at Google and Amazon and so forth. Where they've talked about how they have really built their network as an integral component of their data center infrastructure, and it has to be connected to all the other components of the infrastructure. I think enterprises had that siloed kind of ITIL model where they didn't look at it like that, right? The network was off in its own space, and it was kind of an abstruse specialty that the masters of complexity would handle, right? The
Right.
network, the network specialist.
Yeah.
And if you left those folks to their own design, they were Cisco pros. They grew up on basically doing everything manually, right? And they didn't think about automating. If they did think about automating, it was very kind of piecemeal. When I think really what you need to do is basically take the cue from a lot of the cloud providers. Now I know you're not enterprises aren't cloud providers. I know that. And I know they can't afford to have PhDs as architects necessarily. And I know they can't afford to have data scientists on staff necessarily. And I know they can't necessarily do that. But there are vendors out there and there are tools out there in the open source space that they can use to do automation throughout the whole network life cycle. And I think that is the thing you need to think about, is that don't just automate for day one. Use tools that provide verification at day zero and ensure that any sort of change you're going to make or any sort of configuration you want to apply is going to work. Make sure that you do the pre-testing and automate that. Then you do the day one automation. Then you do the day two automation in terms of having the sort of overall visibility that informs your policy, right? It informs the things that you're doing with your configuration, so that if changes occur on the network, you're aware of them. If security threats occur on the network, you're aware of them. And then the old day end is where it comes full circle, and you're able to do periodic optimizations based on the data that you've we'll call it forensic data, that you've acquired from your observability and your visibility across the network. I think that's the way to do it. But most organizations don't think about it that way. They only think about day one. And I think that's the problem. They aren't really automating in a way that completes the cycle and makes it virtuous. And I do think they have to get there. I think that's ultimately where it's all going, because the network, to our point, as we discussed at the beginning, needs to be continuously available and it needs to be continuously optimized, right? It's not just day one and I'm done. It isn't.
Yes. Oh, man, I couldn't agree more. I think that's been one of the big showstoppers for folks to move into automated networking and getting network to be modernized in the way that applications have been modernized in the cloud, which is, and I've said this in different formats and maybe even on this show, but it's about that mode of operation where when you're building a data center network, you typically build it once, right? You're building a coliseum and you build it to withstand the test of time. And if that coliseum or sports arena is no longer serving the needs of your ecosystem, your sports fans, your town, your city, whatever, like the kingdom, you dynamite it, you build a bigger one and you start. Well, that's the antithesis of cloud, right? It's continuous. There is no coliseum. There is no sports arena. I don't know what the analogy is, but it's constantly moving and growing and changing. It's like an amoeba or something. And so that automation that you mentioned, that continuous life cycle, and not just automating the birth, but the life and the education, and then hopefully not the death. It should live forever. But
that's right.
Yeah, so it's the complete package. And that requires a certain level of sophistication and diligence and commitment, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where I'll say the hardest part, and this is where you really have to look into the data sources that, as many vendors are using kind of cloud sourcing, and that as they build up, everybody wants to kind of give a sheen of AI. And I'm not going to say there are necessarily folks who are AI washing in terms of the way they use the data, but I would, as a network professional, be very careful. You have to know what sort of data sets that they are using for, whether you want to call it a large language model or a smaller model or whatever. You really have to know about the data integrity. I've been experimenting with a lot of the large language model chatbots recently, and they come out with some strange hallucinations, which really concern me.
Yes.
And if you're running your network based on this stuff, and the LLM is just sort of guessing and making this stuff up, that's not good.
I totally agree. You can't, for the whole point of today's conversation, you can't hallucinate the network and get away with it. It's too critical, right? You could try, maybe you could hallucinate a little bit on some of your app services or something, or some of your web content and squeak past it. But man, you can't do that on the network. So this is a patented what he's saying. I think networking is one of the most critical IT services that needs AI, but will probably be the last one to get it
Yeah.
because we're not really in a position where AI is mature enough or networking is intelligent enough for the two to really, or let's just say robust enough or something for the two to meet. And it's tempting to say AI is going to be a game changer in our industry in the next couple of years, that being networking and connectivity. But man, get your ducks in a row before you plug AI into your network, right?
As much as people keep saying it's different this time, I do think it will go through the, the typical valley of despond where, people grow disillusioned because there will be some cases that are absolute disasters in the way it's been implemented, right? Because it's been implemented too rashly without the proper due diligence. But it'll get through that. But you're right. It's going to have to go through a maturation phase. It's going to have to go through its ugly adolescence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to have the seventh grade picture that it regrets.
Yeah, exactly.
With the braces and the bad haircut. Yeah, that's true. I think there is potential for generative AI to provide natural language input output to say your day 2, day 3 stuff.
Yeah,
so it's not
absolutely.
like a total waste there. I mean, it would be better to speak things or ask cool interrogative questions to like a chat bot to learn about your network. So I think that could happen sooner than later. And I think that would be smart.
Yeah, if you think about it as a means of, rather than necessarily kind of as a guru, you ask for answers, but as you use it more to do primary research. I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Yes. So that could be exciting. So maybe I went a little over my skis on that last statement. But in terms of just having AI say design your network and then optimize it for you on a continuous basis, that's what I hope to see in my lifetime. But yeah, you're right. There's going to be some spectacular failures in there.
Yeah, it's funny. And I know there's psychologists who say the reason that it hallucinates is because humans, of course, are ultimately the ones who define these things, right? In terms of the objectives. And we sometimes, people do that, right? They embellish when they get in trouble. And this is exactly what's happening with AI.
Wow. I wish I could get another hour of your time sometime. You just have such a fabulous mind and so many fantastic insights. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, this is great, Woody. Really enjoyed the conversation. This is great fun. Thank you.